What happened to the survivors of the Titanic? The sinking of the Titanic between April 14th and 15th, 1912 is the most famous shipwreck in history, and has become a cultural myth full of legends. 1,357 men, 110 women and 56 children died. 323 men, 324 women and 56 children were saved, for a total of 1,523 dead and 703 survivors. Current life with its social classes, high, middle and low, had its equivalents in the distribution of passengers in first, second and third class. The differences were maintained in death. 97% of the women in first class saved their lives, compared with 49% in third class. 32% of the men in first class survived, to 8% in second class and 13% in third class. As the great tragedy that it was, it gave rise to episodes of heroism, detachment and cowardice, as well as unlikely coincidences. More than 100 years after the accident, we are going to review the dramatic events of the Titanic. Telling the story of 20 survivors in stories that mix heroic acts, vileness and other manifestations of the human condition that emerge in the most critical moments of life. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to keep up to date with our updates. Bayless, waitress. When the Argentinian waitress Var, real name, Virginia Estelle Bayless, boarded the Titanic, she told everyone that she was the daughter of Irishmen. She survived the Titanic, as she had experience in maritime accidents, having been on the liner Olympic when it collided with the British warship HMS Hawke in 1911. His big ship shocks did not end with the Titanic, as he also survived the sinking of the British liner in 1916. On the Titanic, he helped embark Spanish-speaking passengers in the lifeboats. Then, aboard boat number 16, he continued his work on the White Star Line, and 4 years later, the Briton struck a mine in the Aegean Sea and sank, surviving a shipping accident for the third time. He died in 1971 at the age of 83, after 42 years of service. Richard Louis Williams, tennis player. Elite tennis player Richard Louis Williams, who was traveling on the Titanic with his father Edwin, broke a door to free a trapped passenger, for which he was reprimanded by an employee and threatened with charges of destruction of White Star Line property. He survived the tragedy after remaining in the freezing water for 6 hours before being rescued, although his father perished. His legs were so severely damaged that doctors recommended amputation, but the 21-year-old refused. He recovered to win the US Open in 1914 and 1916. Ed Ross Braun, stylist and fashion correspondent. She was the passenger who lost the most suitcases at the time of the Titanic tragedy. After boarding the liner with so many suitcases that she had to rent an extra cabin to store 19 pieces of luggage, she wanted to insure the luggage in Cherbourg, but was told not to throw away her money because the ship was unsinkable. He boarded the lifeboat with a music box playing the song The Ears, with which he distracted the children. He sued the shipping line for the loss of his suitcases in one of the most notorious claims against the White Star Line. After the tragedy, she continued her career as a stylist and fashion correspondent. She died in London in 1975 at the age of 95. Alias Cliver, Nanny. She boarded the Titanic as nanny to Trevor, a 1-year-old baby son of the Elisas, a wealthy Canadian family. She occupied a first-class cabin with the child, and when the accident occurred, she took the baby and boarded a lifeboat without telling the family or anyone else. The reasons for her actions are unknown, as she never spoke on the subject, but she was singled out for causing the death of Nightmare and her daughter LM, as Trevor's mother refused to leave the ship without knowing the whereabouts of her baby. Alice Cleaver died in 1984, taking her secret to her grave. Litigation, actress. Before she was saved in the sinking of the Titanic, American actress Dorothy Gibson was already considered the first movie star and frequently appeared on the covers of Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal and other popular publications. The tragedy helped boost her fame when she played herself in Safe from the Titanic, one of the first films with color segments, shot in less than 2 weeks after the sinking. Dorothy and her mother were traveling on the liner after a 6-week vacation in Italy. They boarded the first lifeboat to be launched into the water. She had not finished disembarking in New York when she was already receiving the movie proposal. The Titan's chef de cuisine, Charles Joe GM, reacted quickly after the collision with the iceberg. He sent his 13 assistants to load food and water into the lifeboats. He went to his cabin for a few drinks to calm his nerves. He returned to the deck and assisted in the launching maneuvers of the boats. He threw about 50 chairs into the sea to help float the passengers in the water. He fell into the ocean when the ship broke apart and remembered the experience as a violent descent down an elevator. He was the last survivor to leave the Titan. Alcohol helped him survive in the freezing water until he was rescued by a boat. Yesterday, young painter Jacques Teller was the survivor who maintained that the Titan broke in two before sinking. Testimony with drawings and stories. His version was verified 73 years after the sinking, when the remains of the famous ocean liner were discovered in 1985. Teller, then 17, was traveling with his parents and saved himself by jumping into the water from a first-class railing near the gymnasium. His mother was able to board a boat, but his father did not survive. While in the water, he was rescued by a lifeboat and then by the RMS Carpathia. He committed suicide in 1945 after 2 years of deep depression over the death of his son Edward in World War II. Madeleine Astor was newly married and pregnant when she married John Jacob Astor, one of America's richest men, in 1911. The couple honeymooned in Europe and visited Egypt before returning on the Titanic's fateful voyage. Madeleine was accompanied by a maid, a nurse and a ballet, as she was pregnant. The 3 women boarded a lifeboat, but Astor and her valet died in the tragedy. Astor's body was recovered in 1916. Madeleine gave up her dead husband's fortune to marry William de Dea, another millionaire. She died in 1940, after marrying for the 3rd time. Michel Marcel and Edmond Diezmo Novrotil, known as the Titanic Orphans, were 2 surviving brothers. They were traveling with their father, Michel Novrotil, who had taken them from their mother during a divorce proceeding. Michel Novrotil died in the tragedy and the children found themselves alone in a lifeboat in the care of women. Edmond died in 1953 and Michel Marcel returned to the limelight in the 1980s when the wreckage of the Titanic was discovered and told his story again. He died in 2001. Frederick Fritz V. Geerfleet was the lookout who spotted the iceberg and sounded the alarm on the moonless night, which made visibility difficult. The 2 lookouts on duty did not have binoculars, which might have helped them see the ice mass sooner. Frederick Fritz was assigned to crew lifeboat number 6, the first one to be lowered into the water after the ship went down. Flip was depressed and ashamed of having survived, and retired from the sea 4 months after the tragedy. He committed suicide at the age of 77 after his wife died and he lost the property they lived in. Masabum Hosono was the only Japanese person on board the Titanic, and his survival in the sinking was also a great humiliation for him in a society where male honor was so important. The 41-year-old man's survival in such shameful circumstances was seen as a national affront. Hosono was a government official and was condemned by the government, the press, and the Japanese population. As the number of lifeboats decreased from number 10, someone shouted room for 2 more. A man jumped aboard, but Hosono did not follow him while the sailors were busy with other things. Joseph Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line in 1907, ordered the largest, fastest, and most luxurious transatlantic liner with his counterpart at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. After the collision, he heard the death sentence of the ship from naval engineer Thomas Andrews, passed through his cabin, and then went to the lifeboat deck, where he boarded one without asking permission, and without anyone stopping him. After being rescued by the Carpathia, he was isolated in the infirmary to avoid the hostility of the surviving passengers. He was savagely criticized on both sides of the ocean for saving himself when there were still dozens of women and children on board. He resigned from the White Star Line in 1913 and died in 1937, deeply marked by the accident. Molly Brown, the unsinkable, inspired the cinematic character of the rich and uninhibited woman who lent Leonardo DiCaprio her son's tuxedo, and taught him how to use utensils at the dinner in the movie Titanic. Margaret Brown was a woman of humble origins who became rich when her husband discovered a gold mine in Colorado. She took charge of Lifeboat No. 6 after sailor Robert Hitchens, who was in command, refused to go back and rescue some passengers in the water. She participated in the organization of the Survivors Committee, and was a fighter for women's rights. Archibald Griswold, 4th Colonel, survived the Titanic disaster but lived less than 8 months after the sinking. However, he had time to write the book The Truth About the Titanic, which is still being published. On board the transatlantic liner, he entertained his first-class companions by telling stories about the American Civil War in which his father had participated. He helped in the launching of the ordinary boats and lent his knife to Officer Charles Lightoller to release the 4 collapsible boats. The ship was sinking and he was thrown into the sea seconds before the Titanic disappeared under the water. Miraculously, he was able to grab onto the collapsible boat that he had helped free, whose passengers were rescued by an ordinary boat alerted with a whistle. He died on December 4, 1912, at the age of 53, and several survivors attended his funeral. Milvina Dean was the youngest passenger on the Titanic and the one who survived the tragedy the longest. She died in 2009 at the age of 97. She was born on February 2, 1912, and on April 10, she boarded the Titanic with her English family as third-class passengers. She boarded Lifeboat No. 10 with her mother and a brother of almost 4 years, leaving her father behind, who disappeared in the sinking. They were the first third-class passengers to board a rescue boat. She never married or had children, and her retirement home was paid for during her last years by a fund to which Leonardo DiCaprio, Winslet, and James Cameron contributed. Eberhard, a girl of humble origins, was 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her mother, Esther, and her father, Benjamin. They were in second class, seeking the American dream, but not in the United States, but in Buenos Aires, Argentina. They boarded Lifeboat No. 11, and she was the only survivor of her family. In Canada, where carpenter Benjamin had a friend who had spoken of the prosperity of the country, mother and daughter were able to board a lifeboat while the father was devoured by the sea. After the tragedy, Eva began to suffer recurrent nightmares that she was only able to banish at the age of 23 when she decided to lock herself in a cabin for 4 days to face her demons. She died in 1996 at the age of 91. Cosmo Duff Gordon, the Titanic's coward, was a member of the British aristocracy, who became famous for winning the silver medal in the fencing competition at the 1906 Olympic Games, although this intercalated Olympics is not currently recognized by the International Olympic Committee. In 1900, he married the famous London designer Lucille Christiana, known as Madame Lucille. The man's prestige collapsed when he bribed the crew of Lifeboat No. 1, saving himself, his wife, and his secretary. He admitted to giving money, but not as a bribe, but as charity, but he was marked as the coward of the Titanic. Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon, was a popular figure in the British aristocracy, who had a brave behavior during the sinking of the Titanic. She boarded lifeboat number 8 with her maid, helping sailor Thomas Jones drive it while encouraging the distressed people and comforting those who had left behind members of their family. She helped steer the boat and helped row all night until the passengers were rescued early in the morning by the Carpathia. As a recognition, the sailor gave her the identification plate of the boat. As recognition, the sailor gave her the identification plate of the boat. She continued to do community work, more overwhelmed than pleased by her hero status, and died in 1956 at the age of 77. Charles Lightoller, second officer of the Titanic, was the highest-ranking sailor to survive the night of April 14. He handed over the bridge's command to First Officer William McMaster Murdoch and went to his cabin. He had already put on his pajamas when he felt the collision. He directed the launch of the boats, constantly repeating the rule of women and children first. He jumped into the water when there was no other way out and held onto the collapsible boat with other passengers until they were rescued. He had a distinguished performance with the Royal British Navy in World War I and died in 1952 at the age of 78. Helen Churchill Candy was a journalist and writer who was a pioneer in feminism. In 1900, she published the best-selling book Women May and Living about how women can make a living. She was also one of the first professional interior designers, with clients including President Teddy Roosevelt and Secretary of State Henry Stimson. When the Titanic disaster struck, she broke her ankle while boarding lifeboat number 6, but she survived. She was a volunteer nurse during World War I and continued to travel and write. She died in 1949 at the age of 90. Which of these stories do you find the most touching, the most infamous, and the most surprising? We hope you found this video helpful. If you have anything to add, please share it with us in the comments section. Like this video and send the link to your family and best friends so they can learn what happened to the survivors of the Titanic. If you're new to our channel, don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back soon with more curiosities from history.